High above the Pacific, in the closing years of World War II, a new kind of aircraft appeared in the skies. Vast, silver, and unlike anything Japan had seen before. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another bomber. It was a technological leap, a flying fortress built to carry destruction across oceans. Its long, glistening wings stretched wide, housing engines powerful enough to lift it higher and farther than any plane before it. Inside its pressurized cabin sat young American crewmen, pilots, gunners, and bombardiers, most barely out of their 20s, their hands gripping controls that linked them to the most advanced war machine of its era. From bases in Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they flew missions that reached deep into the Japanese homeland, beyond the range of earlier bombers, into skies that had once seemed untouchable. To the Japanese watching from below, the arrival of the B-29s was like witnessing an unstoppable force descend from the heavens. The aircraft came in tight formations, glittering like silver specks in the daylight, then unleashing waves of fire and thunder that shook entire cities. The air raid sirens became a sound of terror, the prelude to devastation that came from an altitude too high for most Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft guns to reach. Each mission brought with it not only bombs but a message that the war was closing in, that industrial and urban Japan was no longer safe. For those living in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, the sight of these massive aircraft overhead meant that the heart of the empire itself was now under siege. To American crews, the missions were grueling. The flights were long, cold, and perilous, stretching over hours of open ocean before the glow of Japanese cities appeared on the horizon. They knew that once they crossed that coastline, the enemy's defenses would awaken. Fighters would rise and flak burst would explode like black flowers around them, but they also believed their mission was crucial: to end the war swiftly, to bring home victory through overwhelming air power. Each man knew the risks. A single hit could set the fuel tanks ablaze or tear through the fuselage. Parachuting into enemy territory meant almost certain capture, and capture meant facing a fate few could imagine. The B-29s represented America's final, desperate push to bring Japan to its knees, a war fought not only with bombs, but with fear, endurance, and the cold resolve of men who knew they might never return. The raids over Japan became a grim routine. Each night, squadrons of B-29s would lift off from island airfields, their engines thundering in unison, a deep metallic roar echoing across the Pacific. Crews sat in silence as the planes climbed into the cold, thin air, guided only by instruments and dim red cockpit lights. Below them stretched thousands of miles of open ocean, dark, endless, and merciless. There was no turning back. Every mission carried with it the weight of uncertainty. Mechanical failure, enemy fighters, flak bursts, or bad weather could easily decide their fate before they ever reached Japan. But what awaited them over enemy skies was worse: a storm of fire and steel waiting to tear them apart. As the B-29s crossed into Japanese airspace, the first signs of resistance would begin. Searchlights swept across the clouds, moving like pale fingers in the dark. Sirens wailed across the cities, and anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The sky would erupt with bursts of black smoke and orange flame as shells exploded at high altitude, rocking the bombers with violent tremors. Inside, the crews worked feverishly, pilots keeping formation, gunners scanning the night for enemy aircraft, bombardiers aligning the crosshairs on targets far below. Sweat dripped despite the freezing air, the tension almost unbearable. Every second felt stretched, every sound amplified. The engines hum, the metallic creak of the fuselage, the sharp bursts of flak. Then came the fighters. Japanese Zeros and interceptors climbed fast, sometimes appearing out of nowhere, diving straight at the formation with machine guns blazing. The sky turned into chaos. Tracers streaked in every direction, some curving harmlessly into the night, others tearing through thin aluminum skin and flesh alike. A hit in the fuel line could turn a bomber into a fireball instantly. Crews would hear screams through the intercom, smell the smoke, and feel the heat spreading through the cabin. The gunners fought back desperately, firing streams of bullets from their turrets, watching enemy fighters spiral down in flames. But for every one that fell, another took its place. When a B-29 was hit badly enough to fall out of formation, it was doomed. Those massive engines that had carried them so high now became their prison as they lost altitude. Some pilots tried to make emergency landings on the coast or in open fields, but many never made it. The lucky ones managed to bail out. parachutes opening like pale ghosts against the dark sky. But in those moments of descent, the fear of capture began to grow stronger than the fear of death. The men drifting down knew they were falling into a land that had seen its cities burned, its people killed, its pride humiliated by the very machines they had flown. For Japanese soldiers and civilians on the ground, the sight of parachutes meant revenge. Airmen were no longer seen as regular soldiers, but as executioners who had dropped fire upon sleeping neighborhoods. In Tokyo, Nagoya, and other bombed regions, hatred boiled over. Many of the captured crewmen were beaten before soldiers could even reach them. Civilians, driven by grief and rage, attacked with sticks, stones, and farm tools. Some airmen were dragged through the streets while mobs shouted curses, spitting and striking at them. Even children joined in, their eyes filled with fury born of fear and loss. When the soldiers finally took the prisoners away, their ordeal had only begun. The Japanese military police at the Kempeitai treated downed airmen as war criminals, not prisoners of war. They were interrogated harshly, accused of deliberately targeting civilians. Beatings were common and medical care was rare. Men who had survived the fall from 30,000 feet now faced a different kind of battle. One fought with exhaustion, hunger, and pain. The Japanese believed that these airmen had violated all codes of war by burning cities, rather than confronting soldiers on the battlefield. In their eyes, these prisoners had forfeited their right to mercy. Some crews were captured near coastal villages, where locals handed them over to garrisons. Others were taken deep inland, often blindfolded, their hands tied, unsure where they were being led. Interrogations could last hours or days. Questions were shouted, and when answers didn't come fast enough, fists or bamboo sticks did. For many captives, the goal wasn't to survive, and it was simply to endure. Some were locked in makeshift cells, barely large enough to lie down. Others were paraded before angry crowds as symbols of vengeance. The Japanese guards saw themselves not as violators, but as avengers of their homeland. Even the act of feeding or sheltering prisoners became politically charged. Some officers treated captured airmen as propaganda tools, forcing them to write confessions or record statements condemning American bombing. Others saw them as specimens to study, examples of the enemy's spirit and weakness. Rumors began to spread among Allied forces that downed airmen were being executed, but most back at the bases didn't believe it. They assumed that once captured, their comrades would be treated under the Geneva Convention. They didn't yet understand that to the Japanese, surrender was a stain of dishonor. A man who gave up instead of dying in battle wasn't a soldier. He was a coward. Those who parachuted down alive often faced a fate worse than death in the skies. Some were transported to military prisons in Tokyo or Osaka, where they were interrogated endlessly. Others never reached any prison at all. They vanished, executed in remote locations or quietly killed during transport. For every bomber that didn't return, families back home received the same brief message: missing in action. Few knew the truth, that their sons had fallen not just to war but to vengeance. By the summer of 1945, as raids intensified and Japan's defeat loomed, the hatred toward captured airmen only deepened. Every new bombing ignited fresh outrage. The B-29 crews who descended into that world found themselves facing a different kind of war, one that was personal, emotional, and merciless. They were not meeting soldiers on the battlefield. They were falling into the hands of a nation consumed by loss and humiliation. The skies had been their battlefield, but the ground was their reckoning. For those few who survived capture, the nightmare was only beginning. When the parachutes opened over Japan, the men who had once commanded the skies became small, drifting figures and helpless, exposed and terrified. The roar of engines and gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of wind whipping their parachutes and the faint crackle of flames from the wreckage below. Some had been forced to jump from burning planes, their hands blistered, their uniforms torn by shrapnel. Others bailed out at the last possible second, uncertain whether their parachutes would even open. As they descended, they could see the land stretching beneath them, rice fields, villages, and cities still smoldering from the raids. For the first time, the men saw up close the destruction their bombs had caused. What had looked like glowing targets on radar screens were now ruins, blackened homes, and the shapes of people running in panic. And somewhere among them, Japanese soldiers were already watching the sky. When they hit the ground, the shock of impact brought no relief. Parachutes tangled in trees caught on rooftops or dragged them across fields. Some airmen broke bones as they landed. Others hit the ground hard and lost consciousness. Those who managed to stand found themselves surrounded almost immediately. Civilians, farmers, and even children ran toward them, not out of curiosity but fury. In the chaos of burning towns and bombed villages, these men were not seen as prisoners of war but as murderers who had slaughtered the innocent from above. There were no uniforms of compassion, no white flags, only the faces of people who had lost everything. For many captured airmen, their first moments on Japanese soil were violent and disorienting. Locals armed with sticks, scythes, and kitchen knives attacked them before soldiers could intervene. Some were beaten unconscious, their equipment stripped away as trophies. Others were tied up with rope and dragged through the streets. Women shouted curses, children threw stones, and older men spat on them. The hatred was raw, personal, and uncontrollable. The sight of a downed American airman, especially from a B-29, ignited the same rage that seeing a loved one killed would provoke. The B-29s had become symbols of terror to the Japanese people, the machines that brought fire to their cities and death to their families. Now, for the first time, the people had one of their tormentors within reach. Soldiers eventually arrived to take control, but their treatment offered no comfort. Captured crews were bound, blindfolded, and led away at gunpoint. Some were marched for miles through villages where crowds gathered to hurl insults and blows. A few tried to speak to explain they were only following orders, but language meant nothing in that moment. The anger in the air was too thick to cut through. The soldiers themselves showed little restraint. They struck prisoners with rifle butts, prodded them with bayonets, and forced them to bow before civilians as a form of humiliation. For the captured Americans, every step away from the crash site felt like being pulled deeper into an unknown and hostile world. At the nearest garrison or police post, the captives were thrown into holding cells, dark, filthy rooms that stank of sweat, blood, and fear. Interrogations began almost immediately. Japanese officers shouted questions about bombing targets, military strategies, and the location of air bases. When answers were slow to come, fists and boots followed. Some prisoners were forced to kneel for hours under blinding light. Others were denied water or sleep until they confessed to crimes they didn't commit. They were accused of deliberately killing civilians, of targeting hospitals and schools. To the Japanese interrogators, these were not soldiers who had been captured in battle. They were executioners caught red-handed. The sense of disorientation was overwhelming. Back home, these men had been briefed on the possibility of capture, told that the Japanese might be harsh but that the Geneva Convention would protect them. Yet what they faced was something beyond their imagination. Their captors viewed them not as human beings, but as symbols of the suffering raining down from the sky. Some guards openly taunted them, describing the bodies of women and children found in burned-out homes. Whether true or exaggerated, such words were meant to strip the prisoners of any moral defense. The message was clear. Mercy had no place here. Among the Japanese, there were a few who showed hesitation. A handful of soldiers treated the prisoners with a quiet, uneasy respect, offering small bits of food or loosening their ropes when no officers were watching. But they were the exception. The dominant mood was one of retribution. Every new bombing raid, every new report of devastation, hardened the hearts of both civilians and soldiers. By the summer of 1945, the airmen who fell into Japan were no longer just enemies. They were the embodiment of national humiliation. For the prisoners, the days that followed blurred together. Some were taken to local police stations, others transferred to larger military prisons. They were interrogated again and again, moved between cells, and often beaten for amusement. Communication among prisoners was nearly impossible. Each man was isolated, left alone with his thoughts and fears. The sound of footsteps outside a cell door could mean food, or it could mean another interrogation. Sleep offered no peace, only nightmares that mixed the roar of engines with the echo of screams from the people below. What hurt most wasn't only the pain or hunger, but the realization of how completely the world had turned against them. Just weeks earlier, they had been soaring above the clouds, believing themselves part of a righteous mission to end the war. Now, stripped of their flight suits and dignity, they were reduced to nameless captives in a country consumed by rage. Some prayed, others stayed silent, and a few still believed rescue might come. But deep down, they all sensed the truth. They had crossed a line from which few ever returned. Their journey from sky to soil had ended, But their ordeal had just begun. For the captured B-29 crews, imprisonment in Japan was not defined by bars or walls, but by cruelty that seemed to have no limits. Once they were handed over to the military police, the Kempeitai, the nightmare entered its next stage. The Kempeitai were not ordinary soldiers. They were feared even among their own people, known for ruthless discipline and interrogation methods that bordered on sadistic. The airmen, already battered and weak, were stripped of their remaining possessions and dignity. Their flight suits were taken away, replaced by torn civilian clothes or rags. Some were forced to stand for hours, others to kneel on bare floors with their hands tied behind their backs. The rooms reeked of sweat, blood, and fear, the kind of air that made breathing itself feel like punishment. The interrogations came without warning. Guards would drag a prisoner out of his cell, sometimes in the middle of the night, and march him into a small, dimly lit room. Questions were shouted in broken English. Why you bomb civilians? Where is your base? Who gives the orders? Followed by blows if answers were too slow. Wooden clubs, bamboo canes, and boots did the talking. One prisoner might be beaten while another was forced to watch. It wasn't just about extracting information. It was about breaking spirits. The interrogators wanted these men to feel the same terror they had inflicted from the skies. They wanted to make them confess not only to military actions but to moral guilt. The Japanese viewed captured airmen differently from other prisoners of war. Ground soldiers could be respected opponents, men who had fought face-to-face and been defeated. But bomber crews were seen as cowards who killed from a distance. In Japanese wartime ideology, honor lay in fighting directly and dying for one's emperor. To surrender was shameful, and to be captured alive was worse than death. Thus, the Americans who parachuted down from the sky, men who had chosen to save themselves rather than die with their aircraft, were despised from the start. The concept of humane treatment for prisoners did not apply to those who were seen as war criminals. In the eyes of many Japanese officers, these men were not soldiers. They were murderers who had slaughtered the innocent. Food was scarce, and what little they received barely kept them alive. Bowls of watery rice or vegetable scraps were thrown into their cells once or twice a day. Water was rationed, and even basic medical care was denied. Wounded airmen who had broken bones or burns were left untreated, infections spreading until the pain became unbearable. The guards took pleasure in mocking their suffering, calling them buta, pigs. Some prisoners were forced to clean the floors or latrines even while bleeding or limping. Others were used for propaganda photographs, forced to smile beside Japanese officers or hold signs denouncing American bombings. Behind those images were men who had not slept for days, whose bodies trembled from hunger and exhaustion. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical abuse. Prisoners were told repeatedly that America had been defeated, that their families were dead, that no rescue would come. Some believed it, losing all sense of time and hope. Others clung stubbornly to the belief that the war would soon end, that someone would find them. In those dark, suffocating cells, a man's mind became his only battlefield. Silence was dangerous. Thinking too much was painful. The airmen learned to measure time not in days but in interrogations, in the rhythm of pain and brief rest that defined their existence. Occasionally, new prisoners were brought in, their faces pale and bloodied, their uniforms burned or shredded. From them, fragments of news spread, rumors of other captured crews, whispers of executions or stories of airmen taken to universities for medical study. No one knew what to believe, but each story added to the weight pressing down on their hearts. They understood that the Japanese command considered their lives worthless, and every sunrise could be their last. The walls around them echoed with the cries of other prisoners, sometimes American, sometimes Allied soldiers from China or Britain. Those sounds became a constant reminder of how easily life could end here. Some guards treated their captives with a strange mix of hatred and fascination. They would question them about America, about the machines they flew, about how it felt to command such destruction. There was envy in their eyes, a recognition that these beaten, starving men had once wielded power beyond imagination. But that envy always turned back into cruelty. A slap, a kick, a sneer, reminders of who now held control. Among the Kempeitai, cruelty had become routine, a way to demonstrate loyalty and strength. Showing compassion was dangerous. It could be seen as weakness or treason. For the prisoners, the nights were the worst. In the darkness, they could hear distant air raids, the thunder of other B-29s bombing the very cities where they were imprisoned. The sound brought conflicting emotions. Some felt a surge of pride, a fleeting comfort that their comrades were still fighting. Others wept silently, knowing that every explosion above would only increase the rage of their captors below. The irony was unbearable. The same bombers that once gave them power now sealed their suffering. As weeks turned into months, many prisoners stopped hoping for rescue. Their bodies grew thin, their skin bruised and cut, their spirits dimmed. Yet in quiet moments, some still whispered to each other through cracks in the walls, sharing their names, their homes, fragments of their lives before the war. Those whispers were small acts of defiance, proof that they still existed as human beings. It was all they had left. By mid-1945, the war was nearing its end, though the prisoners could not know it. Japan's defenses were collapsing, cities were burning nightly, and hunger gripped even the civilians. But for the captured B-29 crews, the suffering continued without pause. The cruelty they faced had taken on a momentum of its own, driven by vengeance, fear, and pride. The Kempeitai no longer cared whether these men lived or died. What mattered was that they paid for the fire from the sky, and so they did. In blood, in pain, and in silence. As Japan's situation grew more desperate in 1945, the treatment of captured B-29 crews descended even deeper into horror. The bombings of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka had turned entire cities into ashes, and the rage of the Japanese military reached a fever pitch. Civilians were dying by the tens of thousands, and the government fed the public with propaganda portraying the American airmen as devils who had slaughtered women and children. Every captured flyer became a symbol of vengeance, a scapegoat for the humiliation of a crumbling empire. The line between punishment and murder blurred completely. Guards who once followed orders began acting on pure hatred, using prisoners as outlets for their fury. In some places, the executions began quietly. Prisoners were told they were being transferred, marched out of their cells, and never returned. Others were paraded before angry mobs who threw stones, spat, and shouted curses as they were led through the streets. The Japanese authorities used these moments to prove to the people that justice was being served. For every burned neighborhood, for every child killed by bombs, there was a captured airman to pay the price. The condemned were often tied to stakes, blindfolded, and shot by firing squads, their bodies left in open fields as warnings. In certain cases, officers carried out beheadings themselves, calling it a ritual of honor. The sword fell as the crowd cheered and the war's madness deepened, but not all executions were public. Some were carried out under the cover of secrecy, with motives more sinister than vengeance. In several Japanese universities and military hospitals, a horrifying practice emerged. Captured airmen were used for live medical experiments. The most infamous of these occurred at Kyushu Imperial University, where American prisoners were subjected to surgeries without anesthesia. Doctors removed parts of their lungs or livers to study the effects of wounds. Others were injected with seawater to test its viability as a substitute for saline. Some were dissected alive under the justification of scientific necessity. The doctors involved believed they were serving their emperor by advancing wartime medicine, a delusion that erased all traces of humanity. When the war ended, their actions would shock the world as evidence of a different kind of atrocity. One carried out not by soldiers in rage, but by men of science in cold calculation. For those not executed or experimented on, daily life in captivity became a slow-motion death. Bombing raids made their prisons shake and collapse, forcing the guards to relocate them from one destroyed city to another. Some prisoners were chained together and made to dig trenches or carry supplies for soldiers. Food grew even scarcer as Japan's supply lines collapsed. The airmen watched their captors grow thinner too, but that brought them no comfort, only more danger as hunger made men crueler. The guards vented their frustration on the prisoners, beating them for the smallest mistakes or imagined insults. In certain camps, prisoners were forced to kneel outside during air raids, left exposed to their own comrades' bombs. The message was clear. Their lives meant nothing. Psychologically, many began to break. Some stared blankly for hours, whispering to themselves. Others hallucinated, dreaming of home, family, or rescue that never came. A few tried to escape, but none succeeded. Japan's population was too hostile. and even those who managed to slip away were hunted down by civilians armed with sticks and knives. The hatred of the bomber crews had spread across all levels of society. They were no longer seen as prisoners of war, but as monsters responsible for every tragedy the people endured. Even children were taught to despise them. To be captured alive by civilians was often worse than falling into military hands. Some airmen were beaten to death on the spot by villagers before the police could intervene. Yet, amid all this brutality, rare moments of compassion surfaced. A few Japanese civilians, horrified by what they witnessed, tried quietly to help. A guard might sneak extra food to a starving prisoner, or a medic might dress a wound in secret. In one case, a local priest prayed over a dying airman despite being ordered not to. Such acts were small and dangerous, but they proved that even in a time of madness, humanity had not vanished entirely. Still, these rare gestures could not change the overall reality, that the prisoners were living on borrowed time, caught in a system collapsing under its own cruelty. By the summer of 1945, Japan's defeat was inevitable. American bombers now flew unopposed, and the sky over Japan glowed red night after night. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and rumors spread even within prisons that something unimaginable had happened. Entire cities destroyed by a single blast. The guards grew nervous and unpredictable. Some became even more violent, taking out their anger on the prisoners. Others, realizing the war was lost, fled or pretended to show mercy. For the airmen still alive, confusion reigned. They could hear distant explosions, gunfire, and the fading sound of engines. Some dared to hope that liberation was near, but after months of lies and broken spirits, even hope felt dangerous. In certain prisons, the final days were chaos. Prisoners were ordered to dig their own graves, only for the guards to vanish the next morning. In others, executions continued right up to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. Some airmen were killed that very day, unaware that the emperor had already announced the end of the war. For them, the last sound they heard was not peace but the echo of gunfire or the hiss of a sword. When Allied forces finally entered Japan and began uncovering the truth, they found emaciated survivors, hollow-eyed, barely human shadows of the men who had once flown mighty bombers. They told stories that seemed too brutal to believe, of torture, starvation, and friends who vanished in the night. The war had ended, but for those who survived, the memories never did. The world would soon learn what had happened behind the closed doors of Japanese prisons, and the shock would ripple across nations. Trials would be held, confessions recorded, and names written into history, both of the victims and their tormentors. But in those first moments of freedom, none of that mattered to the survivors. They stood beneath open skies again, blinking in the sunlight, unable to comprehend that they were still alive. What they had endured defied understanding. They had been broken, humiliated, and stripped of everything, yet somehow, a few had lived to tell the story. When the war finally ended and Japan surrendered in August 1945, the truth about what had happened to captured B-29 crews began to emerge, not all at once, but in fragments, through broken voices and scattered reports. Allied forces entering Japan found prisons and interrogation centers that reeked of neglect and death. In some, the prisoners were already dead, their bodies unburied or hastily covered in shallow graves. In others, a few survivors stumbled out when the gates were opened, their faces hollow, their eyes vacant, their bodies nothing more than skin and bone. They had survived starvation, disease, and torture, but survival did not mean freedom from memory. Each man carried an invisible weight, the ghosts of comrades who had not made it out. Investigators were stunned by the cruelty they uncovered. The accounts of beatings, mock executions, and medical experiments sounded too grotesque to be true. But the evidence was undeniable. At Kyushu University, documents and witnesses confirmed that American airmen had been dissected alive. Instruments and photographs were found that proved what had been done under the guise of scientific research. The doctors and military officers involved were arrested, their calm explanations chilling in their detachment. They claimed they were only following orders, that the experiments were for the good of the nation. Some even insisted they had treated the prisoners respectfully, as if such words could erase the horror of their deeds. In other parts of Japan, the Kempei-Tai's prisons revealed stories of random executions, starvation deaths, and systematic brutality. At Tokyo's Kempei-Tai headquarters, Allied investigators found blood-stained walls and instruments used for torture. Testimonies described men beaten until they could no longer stand, then hung by their wrists for hours or days. In Osaka and Nagoya, survivors recalled being forced to kneel motionless while guards kicked them or extinguished cigarettes on their skin. Some were locked in solitary confinement so small they could not lie down. The brutality had no purpose beyond control and punishment. It was not interrogation anymore. It was vengeance. The war crimes tribunals that followed brought these horrors to light. The most infamous cases involved the physicians and surgeons of Kyushu Imperial University. At their trial in 1948, they admitted to performing fatal experiments on captured airmen. Some had removed organs while the prisoners were still conscious. Others had injected them with air or bacteria to study infection. The details sickened even hardened military judges. Several of those involved were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms, yet a few managed to escape punishment entirely, protected by post-war politics and the new American focus on rebuilding Japan as an ally. It was a bitter irony. Some of the men who had murdered airmen in cold blood returned quietly to medical practice years later, while the families of the dead received only brief letters acknowledging their sacrifice. For the survivors, the war's end was not a moment of celebration but of numb disbelief. They were flown back to American hospitals, where doctors struggled to treat their malnutrition and injuries. Many were too weak to stand. Some could not speak for weeks, and when they did, their words came out haltingly, as if their voices had forgotten how to sound human. Military psychiatrists noted that these men showed a kind of emptiness rarely seen, a deep psychological shock that no amount of rest could heal. The nightmares were constant, the sound of boots approaching in the dark, the thud of fists, the cries of dying friends. Some men woke screaming, convinced they were still in their cells. Others refused food, unable to believe that it was truly theirs. News of their ordeal spread slowly. In the first months after the war, the American public was already overwhelmed by revelations of atrocities from Europe: concentration camps, death marches, genocide. The stories from Japan seemed like another distant nightmare, too much to absorb. But as reports were published, outrage grew. Newspapers described the mutilations, the torture, and the medical crimes committed against captured flyers. Families of the dead demanded justice. Mothers who had waited years for news of their sons learned that they had not simply died in battle, but been executed or experimented on. Their grief turned into bitterness. The idea that men who had risked their lives for their country were treated as lab specimens was beyond comprehension. Among historians and soldiers, the question arose: how could this have happened? Some blamed the fanatical militarism of wartime Japan, the cult of the emperor, and the belief that surrender was dishonor worse than death. Others pointed to the dehumanization that total war creates, when both sides stop seeing the enemy as people. The firebombing of Japanese cities had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and for the Japanese military, these captured airmen became living representations of that destruction. Revenge replaced reason. The idea of justice or humanity disappeared in the smoke of burned cities and ruined pride. In post-war Japan, the legacy of these crimes became a source of shame and denial. For years, few spoke of what had been done to Allied prisoners. The war had left the nation devastated, millions homeless, cities reduced to rubble, and a new constitution imposed under American occupation. Many wanted to move forward, to rebuild, to forget, but the memories lingered in silence. A few Japanese who had witnessed the atrocities later came forward, haunted by guilt. Some guards confessed in old age, their voices trembling as they recalled how they had followed orders they knew were wrong. Others took their secrets to the grave. The pain of those years lived on in both nations, divided by what had been done and what could never be undone. For the families of the captured airmen, closure came only through fragments: a dog tag recovered, a photo returned, a letter written in trembling handwriting before execution. Some never even learned where their sons were buried. They lived with the haunting question of what their last moments had been like. The U.S. military honored the dead as heroes, but the survivors struggled with feelings that medals could not ease. They had lived when others hadn't, and the guilt of that survival followed them through life. Many could never fully adjust to peace. Crowded rooms, sudden noises, or the sound of airplanes could send them spiraling back into memory. In the years that followed, Books and documentaries would tell their stories, ensuring the world would not forget. But even retelling could not capture the full weight of what those men endured. It was not just the suffering or death, but the way humanity itself had been stripped away and replaced by hatred, fear, and blind obedience. The tale of the captured B-29 crews became one of the war's darkest chapters. A reminder that in war, the line between civilization and savagery can disappear faster than a heartbeat. And though the victors wrote the history, the pain of those who lived it remained beyond words, carried quietly, for the rest of their lives in the eyes of the few who came home. In the years after the war, as the world tried to rebuild itself from ashes, the story of what had happened to the captured B-29 crews remained buried beneath layers of silence, guilt, and political necessity. The Allied occupation of Japan was focused on reconstruction, demilitarization, and the transformation of an empire into a democracy. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the process, believed that healing the wounds of war required restraint. Japan was no longer an enemy to be punished, but an ally to be reformed. In that climate, the darker corners of the war were quietly pushed aside. Reports of atrocities were acknowledged, trials were held, but soon the focus shifted to progress, not the past. The surviving airmen who had endured the Japanese prisons found themselves living in a world that wanted to forget the horror, even as it celebrated victory. For many of those men, peace was not a return to normal life, but the beginning of another kind of struggle. They came home to parades and family reunions, to a nation eager to honor its heroes, but they carried inside them a silence that no metal could break. They had seen their friends beaten, executed, or dissected alive. They had felt the weight of fear pressing down for months without end. The trauma of captivity followed them like a shadow. At night they woke, drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of boots on concrete, the metallic click of cell doors, the sound of guards shouting in Japanese. Their families noticed the difference. The way their laughter never reached their eyes, the way sudden noises made them flinch. But few talked about it. In those days, men did not speak of nightmares or fear. They buried it under work, under family life, under silence. Some found purpose in telling the truth. A handful of survivors testified in war crimes trials, their voices trembling as they recalled what they had endured. They described the beatings, the starvation, the killings, not for vengeance, but to make sure the world understood what war could turn men into. But testifying did not bring them peace. Many left the courtroom shaking, haunted anew by the memories they had tried to suppress. Others refused to speak at all, locking their stories away for decades. Only when they were old, when the weight became too heavy to carry alone, did some begin to talk, to their children, to historians, or to the pages of memoirs that few would ever read. In Japan, the story took longer to surface. The post-war generation grew up surrounded by ruins and hunger, taught that their nation had suffered greatly, but not always told why. The atrocities committed by their own army, in China, Korea, or against Allied prisoners, were rarely mentioned in schools. For many Japanese citizens, the war was remembered as a tragedy that had befallen everyone equally, not as a crime committed by some. It was only decades later, as Japan prospered and began to confront its wartime past more openly, that the stories of the captured airmen returned to public awareness. Historians uncovered documents, testimonies, and confessions that revealed just how widespread the mistreatment of prisoners had been. Museums began to display evidence once hidden in archives. Newspapers published interviews with aging doctors and guards who had participated in the atrocities, some expressing regret, others still defending their actions as necessary for wartime survival. One of the most shocking revelations came in the 1980s, when new research confirmed the full scope of the Kyushu University experiments. Survivors of the medical staff, now elderly, admitted their roles with a chilling calmness. One said he had removed a part of an airman's liver while the man was still breathing. Another described how they justified their actions at the time, believing that their emperor's cause outweighed the life of a captured enemy. These confessions reignited old anger among Americans and deep shame among Japanese citizens who had grown up believing such horrors were exaggerated propaganda. The truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. The war that had ended 40 years earlier was still bleeding in memory. For the families of the lost airmen, time did not erase the pain. Some continued to search for remains long after official records had closed the cases. Letters written by their sons before missions were read and reread until the paper grew soft. A few traveled to Japan in later years, visiting the sites where their loved ones had been held or executed. Some met with former Japanese soldiers who expressed sorrow and offered apologies. Those encounters were emotional and complex, moments where grief, anger, and forgiveness collided. Some Americans found closure. Others could not forgive. The wounds ran too deep, carved not just into individuals but into the shared memory of two nations. Yet history has a way of transforming pain into reflection. In time, the story of the captured B-29 crews became more than a tale of suffering. It became a lesson about what happens when humanity is consumed by ideology and hate. The B-29s had represented the pinnacle of technological progress, yet their downed crews revealed the vulnerability of even the most advanced warriors. Their fate exposed the moral collapse that total war can bring, when vengeance replaces honor and cruelty becomes a language of power. The men who died in those cells and laboratories were victims not only of their captors, but of a world that had allowed war to erase the boundaries of compassion. Today, memorials and records stand in quiet remembrance of those airmen. In both Japan and the United States, researchers, veterans groups, and descendants have worked to preserve their stories. At Kyushu University, a stone monument now acknowledges the atrocity committed there, a simple inscription expressing remorse for the victims. American families visit it occasionally, leaving flowers, photos, or handwritten notes. The silence of that place speaks louder than any speech could. It is a silence built from grief, acknowledgement, and the faint hope that such darkness will never return. The story of what Japan did to captured B-29 crews is more than a record of cruelty. It is a mirror held up to the human condition, showing how fear and revenge can twist ordinary people into monsters, and how even in the worst places, fragments of humanity can still survive. Some guards defied orders to help prisoners. Some doctors later confessed in shame. These acts, small as they were, remind us that morality never disappears entirely, even when buried beneath war's madness. The legacy of those airmen endures not in the horror they suffered, but in the truth they left behind. A truth that forces every generation to look back and ask, what would I have done? And perhaps that question, echoing through time, is the real victory of the men who never came home. Their suffering became a warning carved into history, that technology, nationalism, and vengeance, when left unchecked, can destroy the very humanity they claim to defend. The B-29s may have burned cities and ended a war, but the fate of their captured crews revealed the cost of that victory, a cost measured not in steel or bombs, but in the fragile lives of the men who fell from the sky and were never seen again. As the decades passed, the story of the captured B-29 crews gradually faded from public conversation, but it never vanished entirely. It lingered in the memories of families, in the quiet pages of declassified military reports, and in the conscience of those few Japanese who dared to confront the shadows of their nation's past. The survivors who had lived through the torture grew old, their bodies frail but their memories sharp as broken glass. Each one carried a private world of ghosts, the cellmates who never came home, the guards whose faces they could never forget, the endless questions that still haunted them. Some spoke to journalists or historians before they died, not out of bitterness but out of duty, believing the truth must outlive them. Others chose silence, taking their pain to the grave. In the United States, the war had long been reframed as a triumph, a story of courage, innovation, and justice. The B-29 bomber, once feared and revered, became a symbol of the technological might that ended the war. The Enola Gay, which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, was restored and displayed in museums as a piece of history, sparking both pride and controversy. Yet behind that shining narrative lay the forgotten men who had fallen from the skies, captured before the final victory. Their suffering was not part of the grand story of liberation or progress. It was a darker, quieter truth, one that complicated the simple lines of heroism and evil. The few who tried to speak of it often found their words lost amid the noise of celebration. In Japan, too, remembrance was uneasy. For years, the horrors inflicted on prisoners were discussed only in academic circles, or by activists seeking to challenge the sanitized version of wartime history. Most citizens preferred to remember Japan as a victim of atomic bombs, of fire raids, of defeat. The idea that their own country had committed atrocities against helpless prisoners was a truth too painful for many to accept. Yet the younger generations, distanced from wartime propaganda, began to ask questions. Schools introduced lessons on war crimes. Museums opened exhibits, and documentaries revisited the Kyushu University experiments, the Kempeitai prisons, and the executions that had followed. Slowly, a national reckoning began, not widespread or easy, but real. The turning point came with the discovery of long-lost wartime diaries, letters, and testimonies hidden in private collections. One such diary belonged to a Japanese medical assistant who had worked at Kyushu University during the experiments. His writings described in chilling detail the procedures and the growing sense of unease among some staff members. He wrote of one young American pilot who begged for his life before being anesthetized and cut open, and of how the staff prayed afterward, unable to look at one another. The diary, published decades later, shattered the remaining denial. It showed not only cruelty, but also the quiet moral collapse of people who convinced themselves that duty excused anything. In that confession, Japan found a mirror, one that forced it to see the darkness beneath its national myth. In America, families of the victims followed these developments with mixed feelings. For some, the truth brought long-awaited closure. For others, it reopened old wounds. Sons and daughters who had grown up hearing fragments of their father's stories now faced the full horror of what had happened. A few traveled to Japan to stand at the sites where their relatives had been killed. They met with Japanese scholars, former soldiers, even descendants of those involved in the atrocities. These meetings were often tearful and complex. Forgiveness was never simple, but in some cases understanding replaced anger. Shared grief has a strange way of eroding barriers. Beneath the layers of history and ideology, people recognized each other simply as human beings, bound by loss, not nationality. As the last witnesses passed away, historians took on the role of guardians. They compiled testimonies, declassified documents and trial transcripts into archives accessible to the public. Their work transformed scattered memories into historical record, ensuring the truth would not vanish with the last survivor. Memorials began appearing in both nations, modest, often tucked away, but deeply symbolic. In Fukuoka, near the site of the Kyushu University experiments, a stone marker stands surrounded by trees. Its inscription reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives here in the madness of war. May such deeds never be repeated." Visitors leave flowers and folded paper cranes, the universal symbol of peace. The air around it is always still, as if the earth itself remembers. The lessons drawn from this tragedy reach beyond the war that caused it. They speak to something timeless, how fear and dehumanization can turn ordinary people into executioners, how science and obedience can be twisted into tools of horror, and how truth, though buried, always finds a way to rise again. The captured B-29 crews were not generals or politicians. They were young men from small towns and cities, many barely 20 years old. They had believed they were fighting for peace, for a world without tyranny. Instead, they became victims of the very hatred they had been sent to destroy. Their story, stripped of propaganda, reveals war not as glory, but as tragedy multiplied by human weakness today. As nations remember World War II through ceremonies and documentaries, the fate of these airmen remains a quiet warning. Their suffering reminds us that even in a just cause, cruelty can hide beneath righteousness. It reminds us that technology and power without conscience can unleash forces far worse than any enemy. And it reminds us that remembering, honestly, completely, is the only defense against repetition. The men who fell from the sky over Japan did not die in vain if their story keeps humanity from walking that same dark path again. In the end, history is not just written in books or carved into stone. It lives in the choices people make when faced with the same moral crossroads. Every generation must decide whether to look away from the uncomfortable truths of the past or to face them, however painful they may be. The legacy of the captured B-29 crews demands the latter. Their voices, though long silenced, still echo faintly, in the wind over Fukuoka, in the creak of aging aircraft in museums, in the quiet prayers of those who remember. They are not just reminders of suffering, but of endurance, proof that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, the will to remember, to bear witness, and to remain human can survive. And as long as their story is told, the world is a little less likely to forget what war can truly do to the human soul.